That's the unfortunate consequence of this, right?
Yeah, no, we'll see you soon. We really appreciate the invite, Evan. It's nice to see you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've always respected the work, so it's long overdue.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so Robert, are we live yet?
I'm going to admit everybody now.
Okay, we're going to see a lot of boxes.
Sweet.
Welcome, everyone. Yes, they're coming in. Okay, I think we'll start. Hopefully more students and faculty will join us shortly. For those of you who may not know who I am, my name is Evan Douglas, and I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And before I introduce our guest speakers tonight, I do want to recognize our distinguished sponsor, Frank Pitts, class of 1975. He's a great friend of the School of Architecture. He's on my Dean's Leadership Council. He's been very generous over the years and a wonderful advocate for this school. So Frank, if you're with us, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce this evening's speakers, Kelly Bair and Kristy Balliet, founders and partners of the internationally renowned firm Bair Balliet. Their joint design venture was founded in 2016 by Kelly Bair, associate professor at the School of Architecture of the University of Illinois in Chicago and a graduate of Colorado University in Boulder and the UCLA Department of Architecture and Urban Design. And Kristy Balliet, professor of design at SoA-RPI and a graduate of Philadelphia University and the UCLA Department of Architecture and Urban Design. Recognized for their more speculative approach, their experimental interrogation of drawings and models since the inception of the firm can be credited for the development of an exquisite body of work, calling attention to the paradoxical nature of architecture as an irreconcilable conceptual and spatial construct caught between the virtual and the physical world. Recalling John Haydick's seminal 90-degree axonometric diamond house drawings that introduced spatial flattening into architecture for the first time as a means to situate the idea of architecture between 2 and 3 dimensions. Bernard Tschumi's iconic Manhattan transcripts, notational drawings, offered as a radical reassessment of architecture as a time-based proposition. And last but not least, Morphosis's sublime 6th Street residence drawings, which superimposed all the projectional systems of the house together as a kind of strange amalgamation of architectural signifiers as an initial leap into the study of deconstruction. The work of Bair Balliet contains a similar motivation and genuine commitment to the generative possibilities of drawing as a critical field of inquiry, essential to the development of their work. Their projects are bold in the iconographic sensibility of their shape grammar, lyrical in the playfulness of their form, sensual in the way surfaces and color envelop the body and the eye, and overall wonderfully authentic and poetically charged as a body of work in search of a distinct voice in architecture. In recognition of their outstanding practice, the work has been exhibited in the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the Architecture and Design Museum in Los Angeles, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, the Knight Gallery in Chicago, and the Miller Gallery at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. They're also co-founders of Possible Mediums, a collaboration with Adam Fuhr and Kyle Miller, fellow designers and educators interested in reassessing the ways in which architecture is taught, produced, and engaged within the public domain. A book on their collaborative work was published in 2018. Please welcome Kelly Bair and Kristy Balliet to RPI this evening.
Dean Douglas, I feel like we should clap for our own introduction.
Yeah, that was amazing,
No,
Evan. Thank you.
deserve it. Everyone's clapping at home right now, I can tell you that.
Or
That's
clapping
beautiful.
their virtual hands. No, Kristy and we give a lot of lectures at various places, and not everyone takes the time to really look at the work and then critically position it within kind of history of other work, people that we've been looking at for a long time. And it really means a lot. It also makes me think that immediately following this lecture, we will rewrite our kind of mission statement on our website for our office. That was really great. Also, thanks to Robert for facilitating this, and the rest of the staff at RPI for making this possible, in addition to the sponsors mentioned by Dean Douglas. And then, of course, the faculty and staff. We really appreciate you tuning in after what is likely a long studio day. I'm going to start with screen sharing to kick us off. There'll be a couple of back and forths here between Kristy and myself, but we'll try not to make it too jumpy for you. All right, so as Dean Douglas mentioned, we are a partnership between myself, Kelly Bair. I'm currently Zooming to you from Chicago, and Kristy Balliet zooming to you from Los Angeles. And together we have an office that no one can spell or pronounce, and spell check doesn't even know what to do with us. So one of the things that Kristy is going to do, and I'm going to run the slides for this bit, is just give a bit of a backstory on how Bair Balliet came to be, starting with this book, or this project, I should say. Kristy, take it away.
Awesome. You'll forward for me, Kelly? That sounds great. So again, thank you, Dean Douglas, for that awesome introduction and for kicking us off, Kelly. So here we're going to begin. Kelly and I first met in graduate school at UCLA, but it was not until we both relocated to the Midwest for teaching positions in 2011, myself at Ohio State University in Columbus and Kelly, the University of Illinois, Chicago, that we began collaborating. Initially as co-curators, along with Kyle Miller and Adam Fure of the Possible Mediums Project, and now as Bair Balliet. In addition to PM, our previous individual practices, Central Standard Office of Design by Kelly and Balliet Studio by myself, offered a common yet distinctly separate playing field for us to begin building our practice. You see, Kelly comes from a place, Kristy comes from a place, or sorry about that. Kelly comes from a place that emphasizes profile. She has a preference for flatness and sharp, witty clarity. However, that clarity gives way to the unusual, typically through emergent three-dimensional formal traits that result from the abstraction of references. In Kelly's work, generic multiplicity yields specific oddities. For Kelly, the standards of architecture, how we draw, how we model, and what we refer to, provides a point of origin for each project, with the final result moving further away from known methods.
Conversely, Kristy comes from a place that emphasizes volume. She believes that volume is authored, and this interest in volume attempts to move beyond the categorization of space as a passive thing to control, and instead asks volume to perform. She prefers the excess and has a predilection for the difficult. Her obsession to expose interiority results in a sensibility that's wrought with expansive qualities, where telescopic enfilades unfold and multiple subjectivities are engaged. Together, as Bair Balliet, we work to merge these independent proclivities to produce something other, something that's neither purely profile nor volume, but somewhere between, and ultimately beyond either individual pursuit. We've titled this lecture Core Work, and as a preamble, we'll look at the common definition of core, and then redefine the term through the lens of our office. And just a small disclaimer, this is the first time we're giving this particular lecture. It's been kind of crafted specifically for you. And so we're kind of our beta testing this one. And so we want to talk about this notion of core as both the kind of foundational principle for the previous work, but also some of the more current issues that we've been grappling with in the office. But to start with the Common Webster Dictionary definition of core, it breaks it down in two ways. The first having to do more with individuals or class or entities, and explains it as a basic, essential, or enduring part, the essential meaning or a group of people. And for us, the rewrite on number one is fairly slight. We'll elaborate that on a second when we show our definition, but we hold pretty close to the common definition. Now, the second definition of core, according to Webster's Dictionary, is much more varied and starts to open up into territories such as fruit, nuclear reaction, nuclear reactors, core studies as in a core curriculum, the maybe architectural understanding that we would all agree with, which is the vertical space in a multi-story building where one would put stairs and elevators. But it's really this one at the bottom, I think, that influences quite a bit of the more recent work, which is a part such as a thin cylinder of material removed from the interior of a mass, especially to determine composition. Now, for the Bair-Balliet dictionary, what began as a negotiation between two autonomous designers has developed into an office with a body of work that embraces as well as redefines the term. For our office, body work is the habitual and continued pursuit of architectural design, punctuated by research topics that push the boundaries of design methodology and the consumption of its artifacts. So to look at our kind of first rewrite here, we understand body work focused on the essential or enduring architectural issues or recurring themes in a body of work that support both past, present, and future projects. And then lastly, as you all now know, we operate in two different cities, Kristy and I, and the group of people, while we might be the core of the office, the group of people that we work with and collaborate with grow and shrink in kind of project specific ways. And so we coalesce or curate groups of people to build our team that bring a kind of specific expertise to a particular project. And so the first project that we show would have a very different type of team that bringing different expertise than, say, the final project that we'll show of the night. This family tree outlines a lineage of work. Not every project, but quite a few of them, the most influential ones that we've done, that is both chronological and conceptually evolutionary. The projects to date are diverse in their scope and medium, yet are bound by their focus on the in-betweens, a diagnosis perhaps traceable to the negotiations happening between two partners in distant cities, across multiple sites, and of course disseminated to various audiences. Each project engages on some level with our notion of a core as both a thing, an object, a building, a prop, and an act, a process, a format, or a mode of communication. This produces two types of cores, not opposing yet differentiated in their approach to design. In both cases, we maximize design with minimal means to produce full wholes that are deliberately incomplete. So just to clarify our definition of a full whole, it's a design methodology that coalesces references into potent concentrations of architectural effects occurring within a small footprint and or with limited mass, volume, or material. Can also be described as a dense spatial territory achieved with an economy of means. One example of this is this collection of study models for our recent No More Room exhibition that ask cores to oscillate between object and backdrop, interior and exterior, and mass and volume. Or here, to move our heads out of the way, or here, a moment within our PS1 proposal, Loud Lines, where a collection of dashed lines intersect and are materialized to produce an atmosphere of pulsating light and liquid effects. And lastly, a film that we produced, directed and produced for Night Gallery in Chicago, titled Another Rear Window, that scrambles the conventional relationship between camera, scene, and audience in an effort to expand the thinness of the screen that comes between them into a more spatial realm. Where full wholes rely on dense moments of spatial and material interchange, incomplete wholes embrace partiality and strive towards an aesthetic of absence. It's a design methodology that cores or samples, that redacts and distills content into new forms of architecture. It's also an architecture that evokes a partial or incomplete construction of a yet to be in the world spatial realm. One example is this collection of planometric core samples that locate the moment of spatial density within an iconic domestic interior, as opposed to where we might normally place it, which would be the programmatic center, such as the circulation core, or a geometric center that one might find through a center point. Or here, a shelf that riffs on IKEA's best-selling shelf, the Lap, implying its original proportions through thick lines as opposed to a thin laminated surface. Or lastly, in a built project for the Boys and Girls Club of Los Angeles, where surfaces are color blocked with figural planes to suggest space without matter, reconfiguring an existing space into many and asking visitors to fill in the blanks. Tonight, we'll present 5 projects that make a case for cores and further illustrate how we define them. With that, I'll hand it to Kristy. Costume change number 1.
Thank you, Kelly. Let's see how smooth I can be here. How's that looking? Fantastic. Okay, so again, it's always difficult to figure out which projects to share in the context like this, but I think with the setup of cores, we kind of went back and looked at some of our past work and looked at the projects that maybe most set us up for this kind of more current work that we're developing related to cores and the incomplete. So I'm going to take you back to our first project that we'll show. Tonight is also the first project that we did as Bair Balliet, titled The Next Port of Call. It was commissioned by Monica Ponce de Leon and Cynthia Davidson, curators of the 2016 Venice Biennale, and exhibited alongside 11 other US architecture firms that year in the US Pavilion. We were given a rather vast site, 26 acres situated between the Detroit River to the south and to the north, an industrial district mixed with rapidly gentrifying residential neighborhood called Corktown. The post office, which was also located on our site, was 1 million square foot of late 50s modernism, sitting on top of plinth, offering both a potential platform for viewing the river and at the same time presenting a barricade to the neighborhood for viewing and accessing both the river and the potential for a large public park that fronts it. For us, this site was like many others in Detroit. It exemplifies the tenuous relationship between the built and unbuilt that the city is infamous for. In Detroit, scale or perceived depth is a funny thing. Due to high vacancy rates, we are privy to a different relationship to buildings in 2 unique ways. First, we experience buildings in the round. All elevations are exposed, making relationships like front, back, and side ambivalent toward its subject. Second, we look through or between buildings, beyond our immediate context and towards a seemingly flat city beyond. Depth and distance factor into this perception in very different ways than most typical urban centers. And knowing the future plans for densifying Detroit, we look for ways to preserve these unusual spatial experiences within our proposal. This meant that a singular monolithic building scheme was out of the question. Instead, the project developed a strategy of multiplicity and composition. Many buildings situated to highlight the spaces in between as much as the buildings themselves. The interstitial zones that are frequently neglected or simply left over, inner courts, porticos, and plazas that enhance civic life were placed in direct dialogue with building mass. These two elements, solid and void, populate the park in an orchestrated yet casual composition. The project formalizes this idea about multiple fronts. We see this in Albert Kahn's 1922 General Motors headquarters, tied at the base with a plinth, but free to expose its many faces in its split tower. The building became one of several Detroit architectural history that we gave a nod to. To develop a formal strategy, we composited iconic Detroit profiles of various scales and types, allowing us to sample and abstract characteristics as well as exaggerate elements. We developed a taxonomy of building types from which new profiles were designed and arranged on planometric circles of varying size and distances from one another within the park. At the same time, we were building another taxonomy, an analytical one, as opposed to the more projective one that I just described, around architectural elements that have historically challenged our perception of dimensional bigness and visual depth. Things such as plinths, where a mass relates to its ground, or a parapet, where a mass relates to the sky, or partial walls, as mass relates to void. All elements that highlight the qualities of what we now define or are working on as the incomplete. So in this project, when we were charged with keeping some aspect of that large post office, Kelly and I proposed a 45-degree shear to the side facing the river. This shear transformation, paired with the insertion of large, incomplete volumes that intersected the facade, transformed the overall mass from a solid wall to a thick threshold. Where volume meets planar facade and the building itself is literally cut away to expose the interior. The objective for the park was to preserve porosity through a loose collection of multiples. While designed in the round, each building reveals their spatial qualities through moments of disruption where two-dimensional profiles and surface edges produce planar breaks in an otherwise three-dimensional circular sequence. These disruptions expose the building section to the exterior, implying spatial continuity despite physical separation. And by dividing a complex site of 14 buildings into 4 zones, we looked for balance between areas of heavy detail and zones of pure white or light hatch, intentional cropping of other zones adjacent to the picture frame establishes a specific narrative for each panel while offering a constructed continuity between the panels. In total, there were 4 drawings that described the site of 14 buildings. And you can see here on the right, a shift from the elevation oblique to a worm's eye oblique shifts the setting from the project's representation from the exterior to the interior, revealing volumetric cuts into the existing building and the underlying geometry of their construction. In 2018, we were selected as finalists for the Moma PS1 Young Architects program. For approximately 20 years, the program has now since ended. Architects competed to develop a proposal for the courtyard of the Moma PS1 branch in Queens. The courtyard and installation hosts and engages thousands of summer visitors as part of their annual DJ warm-up sessions. We titled the project Loud Lines. Riffing on Robin Evans, who famously stated that architects do not make buildings, they make drawings of buildings. Flipping that, we proposed that architects make a building of drawings. For that summer, Bair Balliet invited Moma and summer visitors to PS1 to inhabit a drawing. In the project, Loud Lines reimagines a new way to inhabit the courtyard. It challenged the PS1 paradigm, which tends to fall into one of 2 categories, canopies or objects. Instead of drawing the perimeter and making a canopy or placing an object, we proposed frames, a composition of lines that oscillate between the two. By drawing a main courtyard, a triangle and a rectangle, first two-dimensionally, and then generating volume, the shapes were then rotated and materialized, effectively creating two space frames that intertwine. Lines are used in two primary ways. First, as frames, creating large, visually porous space frames for visitors to see and be seen. And second, as a surface, creating a dense canopy for maximum shade within the pocket courtyard. In terms of how, we proposed a robust system where the abstract lines are materialized using HDPE, large diameter rigid pipe. These pipes are typically used for water management. In terms of fabrication, small pellets are melted into a liquid material that are then extruded and die formed into a solid. For this project, we proposed using a range of diameters from 12 inches all the way up to 60 inches. We selected the double wall type with a smooth interior and corrugated exterior for its texture and structural capacity. Your experience would have changed based on your proximity to the elements and the time of day. The pipes strategically hit the ground to accommodate long benches, approximately 100 linear feet. The pipes could have been cut with a basic saw and heat seamed for standard mitered connections. However, complex intersections would have been robotically cut. To that end, there were two types of end caps. The standard cap would have been vacuum formed out of plastic, and 4 to 5 custom caps of fiberglass would have added structural robustness when needed and design nuance intersections into the system. The intersections were designed to casually sit on the wall, peek over the edge, and reach high into the air, contributing to their flickering quality between line and object. As you approach the site for the party evening, the project had the intentional role of being both designed as both foreground and background. When you enter into the courtyard, you first encounter the project, which is both full and incomplete at the same time. For the next project, the story of cores in many ways starts in the middle for us. In 2018, we were obsessed with middles, primarily the absence of them. Similar to previous projects, for example, the next port of call that I just presented earlier, we moved away from the singular building in favor of a collection of buildings. There, in the next port of call, it was about ploys of scale and appearance and how things are not quite as they appear. In that project, we looked at this question through plinths, bottoms, partial walls, often middles, but sometimes bottoms or tops, and parapets, always tops. The project No Middle Mid-Rise revisited our fascination with the role of tops, middles, and bottoms by redacting the middle. Redaction for us is a two-dimensional visual technique that masks out selected information. Here in these precedent studies, we use redaction to place emphasis on the top and bottom, where buildings negotiate the ground and sky. A building with no middle is like pulling your hat over your face or pulling your tube socks up to your waist, or even better, vice versa, or with pants on your head. In other words, a project that's sort of intentionally incomplete. Another ambition of this project was to work on cores while challenging extrusion. Of course, a common trope and technique for the development of cores within architecture. Our cores had the potential to accentuate the relationship to the ground, a bit of a weeble wobble, reliant on a stabilizing bottom, or accentuating the relationship with the sky with the use of an inverted colonnade. In terms of the rib development of the core, here we riffed on an earlier project, the loud lines research that I just showed you, and the building could be where the building could be a volumetric line, the loudest of lines, or a set of quiet lines in what you see here in the ribs. The plans offer a look at the composition of an interior with no corners and varied relationships with perimeter access, with perimeter enclosure. Access is now provided from the perimeter at upper levels. The front door expands beyond the elevator doors and associated lobby. Here, the entire floor has the potential to be a lobby. As started in the early 2000s and accentuated even more in the last year, the office building continues to be rethought from every angle, from how we work, why we work, and where we work. Do we even remember we work? The implications of how we arrive, how long we stay, and move through and depart buildings were examined in this project as we reimagined the multiplication of thresholds and viewing windows within the city. Building access and transition volumes such as porte cocheres, lobbies, and circulation cores are now distributed throughout the building, offering vertical ports of entry embedded at all levels, rather than limited to the ground floor. Facades here are animated by the constant hum of arrival and departures. Flight paths participate in the frontal elevations as if hot-wired to electrify the void between the building masses. Seen here in this isolated elevation of the core elements, each building or floor or designated set of floors could have had a potential port and address beyond the typical X and Y. Now we could potentially include those external thresholds in the Z axis. So for no middle mid-rise is ultimately made up of three types of parts: the cores or the drums, two volumetric vessels that contain the offices and public space, the skirt, a plinth-like mass that anchors the now liberated ground plan, and the legs, vertical circulation cores that unite the distributed ports to the city. Transforming the conventional three parts of the building, the project lifts the bottom and stretches the top downward, effectively rendering the middle and the repetitive uninterrupted center of the mid-rise obsolete. And now to kind of shift more towards what we're going to talk about for the second half of the lecture, I will shift to research entitled The Core. As we often do in the office, in the summers, we make intentional shifts, this time from redacting the middle to making it the focus. The shift corresponded with our desire to rethink the core and consider the role of the stable and unstable in architecture. To consider this issue, it makes sense that we started with the home. We started by looking at what holds it all together, the core. The core of a house migrates, sometimes located at the geometric center and other times assigned based on value or a role, such as a hearth, a stair, or a courtyard. And of course, there's a double meaning. A core sample in both geological and architectural terms maps time and spatial layers. So we dove into the cores, 22 cores that were abstracted from homes between 1750 and 2009, spanning the compartmentalized foursquare and the open plan. Happening in parallel to the core sample analysis was a research project we entitled The Unstable Image. We were writing a few articles at the time, and we were trying to work through the issues for those articles under this umbrella research topic entitled The Unstable Image. It was a problem that was born from three observations. One, cultural, mainly social media. Two, disciplinary, the emergence of image as an architectural problem. And three, professional. Clients were starting to be obsessed with HGTV before and after remodels, Wayfair, shop the look visualization, interfaces, etc. It was developed through text, tested in workshops with students and office staff, and informal design exercises between Kelly and I. As a research project, it learned from the cores analysis and began by assembling disparate cores together in order to produce the spatial equivalent of quantum mechanics. Stripped of materiality, their formal logics, and total unawareness of their context, the samples are ambiguous in their attitude towards interiority and exteriority. Viewed frontally, they oscillate between continuity and disruption, suggesting we might be in two or more spaces at the same time. Steeped in representational process, though processes more related to film and set design than architecture, at least to start, this particular design exercise used the Instagram story transition interface as software to transpose digital modeling images of disparate core samples. Here, a scene diagram establishes the relationship of characters and the choreography of their locations related to both front, middle, and back, as well as in the round. Green screen techniques are employed in an attempt to converge a centralized 3D core sample, static 2D projection planes, and rotating Instagram transition cubes all together. At its core, the unstable image is both a representational act for viewing architecture, as well as a tool for designing spatial occupation that is both subjective and objective simultaneously. Final handoff.
Costume change. Okay, inspired by the unstable image research that Kristy just presented, House of Cores is our first smaller scale project rooted in the domestic realm. Pairing precedents of core-based houses of the past, such as Morphosis's 2468 house, which we understand to be kind of core as room, or the Arinda House by Charles Moore, which we understand to be a kind of captured core or core as spatial column. And then finally, and maybe tapping back into Kristy's setup of the unstable image and the kind of split screen aesthetics, which by the way, were something we were looking for well before we all lived in a split screen aesthetic world of Zoom. Is the Diller and Skiff video with drawing room, which we understood to be a kind of series of split cores. House of Cores is situated in the semi-urban neighborhood of Venice, surrounded by traditional Southern California bungalows. The house encourages multiple scenarios for domestic living and working, renting and owning, present and future, and challenges the long-standing notion of mine and yours by fostering core migration, both within a single lot line as well as across it. I'll flip through this a couple of times just to kind of set it up and go back. In society's constant search for perfection, a range of social, political, and cultural forces point to a history of addition and subtraction for the house typology, with core both internal and expelled. Today, the ability to accumulate and purge offers multiple options for redefining how one or many live. This replica or this GIF essentially riffs on a game that most of you probably don't remember. If you remember the game of Perfection, you're probably our age or older. But essentially what Perfection does is it kind of hybridizes time, space, and parts and wholes. And so essentially in the original game, you turn the dial, the timer starts, and you have a certain amount of time to get all of the puzzle pieces fit into the game before everything explodes out from this rising ground plane. In our case, we looked to a kind of setup of the cores as pieces, and we distribute them throughout a block in the Venice, kind of typical block in the Venice neighborhood. And we allow time to kind of reshuffle and plant these in different locations, both within their lot and across the lot. Interrogating cores, both the literal and conceptual point that holds a house together, requires one to pull it apart spatially, formally, material, and programmatically. For this scenario, cores are loosely stitched back together with a porous ring that vacillates between having the appearance of barely containing them to fully absorbing them. From the front, House of Cores plays by the proportions set forth in the neighborhood roof lines, contrasting only through its geometry, though with a nod to the sloped pitch of the surrounding bungalows. And from the alley, the ring is revealed, fronted by a carport that follows the height line established by adjacent carports. The plans reveal a leaky relationship between rings and cores, a reversal of the indexical massing and material delineation that's visible from the outside. Walls are cut away at the interior, allowing for continuous circulation and programmatic ambiguity. The four cores are extracted here, illustrating their programmatic interchangeability. In this scenario, the largest core offers sleeping, living, and bathing for one or several. The upper right, a medium-sized core that functions as an ADU or an extension of the larger core's programs. On the lower left, a small core for dining with an office up top through a sectional offset. And on the lower right, an extra small core for exercise or storage with the attached carport. A view from inside the medium core looking out towards the courtyard shows the compressive nature and the kind of transmutability between from core to core and core to ring. And then a view from the exterior courtyard where essentially we have little acknowledgement to the external context at this point. Returning to the front view for a moment, we see that House of Cores is oriented rather traditionally to the street-facing facade. A related project that sort of falls under the umbrella of the unstable image, but also shakes out as a kind of continuum of House of Cores. We see this as almost a piece that spun off the main house. It's an ADU called Writer's Block, located in Studio City, California. Here we see the rear yard is prioritized as it acts as the hinge between the existing house and the auxiliary programs that spill out of it. Contextually, it's nested between the existing house, which is shown here, and the neighbor's privacy walls, which are shown here and here. This is the neighbor's house. In this case, the programs are distinct, yet coexist within and around the building block. For example, a space for a screenplay writer with a writing loft, shown here in the second floor plan, and a screening room at the bottom that it's adjacent to a gardening area and pool storage zone. Exterior forms emerge from the main body of the house, what we call the block, acting as partial backdrops for activities such as dining, gardening, and swimming, yet they do the traditional work of semi-coverage or semi-enclosure. So for example, their awnings, their coves, and their entry landings. The last project that we'll show tonight was our recent exhibition in the SoA-RPI Gallery titled No More Room in 2021 this year. Under the influence of the unstable image and on the coattails of House of Cores and converging sharply with the rise of the pandemic, the exhibition took to a combinatorial design approach that was less about abstraction and more about intensification. The emphasis on not many, but one single designed core, seen here on the right in white, forced a dialogue between an architecture of the incomplete and the constructed world necessary to fill it out. An approach to filling a gallery that is a potential antidote to the scarcity of means that often come with these types of design exhibitions. In this series of study models for the core, we see semblances of elements we know: walls, soffits, columns, parapets, ceilings, stairs, and floors. Conceived of as the core sample taken at the convergence of multiple implied rooms, the zones of each core are independent of one another, yet seemingly aware as geometries are traced around, across, and through the circumference of the object. Reliant on and completed by multiple subjects, perceptions, and associations, No More Room redefines the spatial and experiential limits of a gallery. It leverages the contemporary relationship between the rooms we inhabit and the images we consume to produce this sense of being in multiple spaces at once that Kristy mentioned, a type of quantum superimposition in architectural terms. It's a layered construction of volumetric relationships centered around a designed core sample, which you see in white here. In the gallery, the project aims at the perception of fullness over literally filling it with matter. There are minimal material objects, one core, and 3 blue screen walls that expand and contract the space of the gallery. Geologic in nature, the core represents a partial architecture embedded with information from many points of origin and melds their traits to find completeness in the round. It asks backgrounds and middle grounds to foreground spatial experience. Cultural production pivots during unstable moments, often utilizing fragments to reflect the fragility of our environment. However, No More Room prefers an architecture of the incomplete to an excessive reconstruction of parts. Leveraging our aptitude for habitual cropping, framing, and construction of one's world that merges our physical thresholds and virtual realms, a core sample is employed as both a process and a product here. The core is both an object and a backdrop. As an object, its base sits unsteady on the ground, reaching up to reveal its roofline to the building exterior. As a backdrop, it leverages muteness, allowing overlays of various associations as opposed to specific architectural elements. Core sampling produces an inherent outside from insides, making it both an interior volume and an exterior mass. A design core is a projective act, renders walls obsolete as it reveals unforeseen relationships between rooms, in this case, figural rooms. Formal negotiation is favored over extrusion and challenges the notion that the core is a vertical connection between floors or a geometric center between rooms. No More Room represents a collection of spatial intensities at this intersection. Blue screen walls, devices normally used to project a limitless and immersive environment, are misused. Here, edges are exposed, highlighting the potential zone between one world and the next. As an alternative to full immersion, surfaces meant to be invisible in order to complete a scene, instead are objects that redact and replace visual content. The exhibition is a partial construction and a finished stage designed for viewing in multiple states. A split screen aesthetic broadcasts the physical side in the form of live feed surveillance video, which you see here on the left, and its virtual side through animated content. The exhibition is revealed episodically through the run of the show as it unpacks the many ways that we encounter rooms, from episode 1, where we're looking at hypnotic repetition of similar to an open plan, or episode 2, where we begin to understand radially or centralized organizations, to the third, which is about an unfolding and sequential kind of enfilade procession from room to room. The choreography between the point of view of the physical camera, the point of view of the digital camera vis-a-vis the rendered imagery, and the physical matter that's constructed in the gallery yield a sense of being in between for both in real life visitors and virtual visitors. And even for us in opening night, as we attempted to host a kind of both in-person and virtual event that put us both in the same place. Kristy standing next to the physical construction of the core, and me being through special effects kind of imported into the scene, that we are able to sort of live in between these two worlds, regardless of where we're actually tuning in from or how we're tuning in. So just to close, I'm going to let this play. And while the term core has been used specifically to design and produce more recent work in the office, we find its conceptions in the early body of work foundational, making it a kind of bedrock for their office ethos, a pursuit towards an architecture that is both and, flat and full, interior and exterior, one in many, And lastly, one that possesses the capacity for space to engage with multiple subjectivities. So we're gonna close with that. We'll leave this up, but essentially what you're seeing here is the virtual manifestation of the SoA-RPI exhibition with the live feed on the left, and our episode 3, which is the episode that closed out the exhibition in June of this year. So thank you very much. We're happy to take some questions. Or
Wow,
elaborate on anything.
unbelievable. Amazing. Wow, was that thick or what? Talk about a tremendous number of ideas and strategies, and you guys have only been working together, what, since 2016?
Yes. Yep.
It was meant to happen, Kristy and Kelly. No, you guys are, wow, really, really amazing work. Before I open up a conversation with you, I urge the students and faculty to send questions. Come on. I mean, if you're interested in exploring ideas or opening the work from a variety of different vantage points, the only way we're going to be able to accomplish that is if you participate in the discussion. So look, there's no, my goodness,
It's a lot.
you know, it's
dense.
It's very dense. And it's something I'm fascinated about, your use of language, and in the beginning of the presentation, it's almost, there was a series of primitive or underlying conceptual terms which you tried to draw inspiration from, both on a literal level and conceptually you were reinterpreting them, not unlike the material. So they underwent a kind of evolutionary transformation, like a play on words, right? And it seems that it's like a great magician keeping something afloat. And the moment you're about to identify what in fact is the root of that trick, it's changed, and one is no longer able to have access to that and moves on to another performance. And I say that as a compliment, because there's a kind of deep interest in gaming here and playing with paradoxes, right? Maybe a series of accepted, a kind of nomenclature for architecture, right? A foundation of thought. I mean, there's a kind of, the work is a critique on a series of paradigms that have been universally shared, and how should I say it? A certain amount of reverence has been assigned to them. So it's a very subversive practice, but not in a flippant way, in a very serious way, right? So let's begin with your methodology, because and you're doing this in a variety of ways. Am I right? It went very quickly. Am I right to understand that a good portion of the source material actually makes reference to a history of architectural production, but you unmake those artifacts in such a way that there's a percentage of its iconographic reference made available to the observer, to the point where it's almost like to the refined eye, and I'm talking about the architect, the architectural audience might be able to enter into the game and begin to place back into its original position this source material. but someone who was less refined, sophisticated, and kind of exposed to the strategies that you're pursuing, it moves into a world of a kind of radical abstraction. In other words, I'm really interested in the question of legibility. You know, and I'm reminded of Eisenman's work, right? Who was extraordinary in the second half of the 20th century through this iterative process, where he would reveal the iterative sequences of change and transformation from one step to the next, and then there was a final stoppage, and that was the proposal. It seems to me to truly understand the ingenuity of your work, one has to move into the kind of theater of operations and try to decipher what you've invented from one stage to the next, because the process is so inextricably linked to any one outcome. I don't know if there are more questions in there, but.
Well, I think we intentionally, sorry for the pun, but I think we leave out the middle. So I think Eisenman would supply the diagram that takes you from the reference to the final house or the final thing, right?
Right.
We think of the numbered houses, and that diagram is critical both for those in the know and for those outside of the know. I think for us, we don't have that. There is no diagram. There is no middle diagram that traces a kind of transformation from the source material or the reference to the final thing. In fact, we almost intentionally deeply analyze it, deeply understand it, and then don't use it. We generate new geometry, new kind of surface qualities to intentionally not forget it, but I think we pay homage to it by the fact that we put it in the lecture. But yeah. I think that's maybe what differentiates us from other contemporary practices right now is we're not using the literal source material. We're not recombining it. We're not, it's not a collage problem. We really hope it isn't a decom problem. So I think that's maybe where we would make the distinction between someone like Eisenman and our office.
Kristy, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I guess as you were, first of all, that was like, I was like jotting down notes as you were talking. That was like, we gave a dense lecture, you give a dense question. It's like sparring here. It's great. But I think that, as you were talking, I was just thinking that part of what, when you say we kind of lean on methodology in some ways, or like the methods of architecture, drawing, modeling, or even terms, I think it's interesting. I think that some of that goes back to some of Kelly and I's origin dialogues, which was through the lens of possible mediums, where the original possible mediums was looking at the artifacts that architects usually use to define their work, models, drawings, objects, et cetera, and looking to kind of expand how you could use different methodologies, but reference heavily and understand completely the ones that came before you. So I guess that would be one aspect of it. I think the other thing, I really like Kelly's answer actually, of like, we kind of let out the middle. I think that's related to two things. One is, I think maybe what links us to Eisenman or anyone really obsessed and interested in architecture is Kelly and I are really deeply, we think it's really deeply important to be observant of architecture, to look, to see, to understand. But I think as it moves along and as we extract what we observe in it, a big difference might be the fact that we really lean into the partnership of it. So at least up to this date, every project that we've done, we wrestle together. So we don't assign, it's not like one partner works on one project and another partner works on another. I think that the middle has to go away because what we observe and what we prioritize is always going to be slightly varied between the two of us. And so then as we pull it back together as a project, that middle gets muddy. That middle is sort of intentionally muddy, which I think gets us, to something I think we were quoted once of saying, like, we know we're in the right direction if we've developed something sufficiently weird. But I think that sufficiently weird is not, it's like you said, it's not sarcastic. It's not meant to be like weird in kind of a flippant way, but kind of weird in the way that it feels like it, but it's uncanny in the fact that you absolutely do not.
Yeah. No. That's a good place. It's a good place to be. So, Peter would be entirely transparent of each and every operative phase. And it seems to me in a project, I'm referring to yours, where you're interested in contradictions and inflections and getting lost and getting found, that even within a kind of linear trajectory, you would introduce a kind of inflection so that a kind of second strain of bias would enter into the project unexpected. So I would imagine there's a high degree of chance that you guys embrace and in fact you promote as a way to maybe temporarily distance yourself as author of the work, so something again unexpected would emerge. And that's precisely why you've structured it that way.
I think that's correct. It's funny. It's, both Kelly and I teach pretty extensively. And I feel like what you just said, Evan, in a lot of ways is how I kind of structure or how I think of pedagogy. And maybe I think in a lot of ways how we work as an office is, it's not very different. As designers move from kind of idea to where it lands, is actually designing into curriculum, like that moment where things can go multiple directions, as opposed to a curriculum that is like fully prescriptive all the way through. It definitely, I think there's always moments in Kelly and I's project where you kind of have to, like in our process, where we sort of hold our breath. And you sort of hope that like the setup and the research is going to get you where you think it might get you. But I think intentionally, I would be alarmed if one day the formula was so clear that I didn't have that scare.
No, that's great. It's okay. So it's interesting when you move out of the drawing, out of that kind of generative process of representation, and it has to meet the world. So in no particular order, the PS1 project, which was really quite beautiful. And if I understood correctly, maybe in the early stages of that project, there was the recognition that there's a ready-made industrial artifact that's available or comes close as an approximation to some of the kind of shape grammar that you were playing with, and you decided to, we can build with that. And then you mentioned, if I remember correctly, it varied from 12 inches to 60 inches in diameter. Was that correct? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
And so these elements migrate through the field or the line work, both above one's head and on the ground plane. And at some point, they, especially, and I'm just kind of reminded in the, I don't know if it was a rendering or a model, you showed a snapshot of a person sitting on one of these volumes. So it took on a kind of ergonomic value.
Yeah, those were the 18-inch diameter ones.
Right. So, I mean, it's, in a world that values like productive absurdity.
Does it? I wish it valued that more.
No, in your world.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The world outside of your practice. Yeah, I'm really interested how the tension between the two, because those volumes obviously within the kind of culture of architecture seem to imply the occupation of something, and I'm purposely making that vague.
Right.
They do a form of work on a haptic level in terms of furniture when they hit the ground.
Mhm.
I'm assuming they still reside, and maybe I'm missing something, within a kind of conceptual domain. In other words, they're aspirational, aren't they? In terms of what they could be if given more time, more economic power, more architectural real estate.
Well, actually, yeah. So, I mean, this model is a little misleading because one of the things we never wanted to do with the project, with the exception of this one moment here, is show the interior of the tube. We didn't want one to ever be able to look down. So this is a kind of a core sample out of the bigger model.
Yeah.
And the purpose of that was to always understand this as a kind of three-dimensional volumetric line that didn't necessarily have an interior. The interior was meant to be the kind of implied space, that one would find between the lines. It started out as a drawing with us assigning particular proportions and certain aesthetics that we wanted for the intersections to occur at the intersections. But at a certain point, mainly based on how quickly PS1 moved, you win, which is like, if you win, you start building it the next day. It actually went through, and we didn't include this slide, but there's a hilarious slide of the first structural analysis of this project, of this model right here. And it is like red everywhere because we were drawing the lines with aesthetics and proportions in mind, not with structural prowess. And so it was a really interesting back and forth with the structural engineer for two reasons. One, the distribution of diameters became really important. So where we might have wanted a lot of shade and like the biggest pipe, we actually needed to minimize it or something. So we were kind of almost like a puppet, like tweaking all of the diameters and the intersections of these things. And then I think the second thing that became really important was the fact that this is a system that is typically used underground. So it works really well under compression. But it doesn't span well. It's a plastic. And so we had to conceive of, the structural engineers had to conceive of new charts that would like essentially say like this diameter is going to span this amount, because we really wanted to, as much as possible, make this a kind of singular system. So there's steel in the ground, but there is no steel anywhere above in the piece. So it is actually engineered plastic in a way.
Well, that's not, there would have been some at a few intersections.
There would have been some.
It's
true.
Can you go to the last image of this project, Kelly? Yeah. I love that Kelly noted that, because you can see all those columns, Evan.
Yeah.
They're in this. I mean, we weren't
those out, Kristy.
Well, we're not necessarily hiding them, but I think it's interesting maybe also for the students to know that half of our budget for this project would have been in the ground.
Right.
Because a huge part of what would have needed to happen structurally would be to hold this thing down from flying away. Once we figured out the spans, the other part was kind of holding it down. But I wanted to end with this slide, maybe just to add on to Kelly's answer to you, Evan, is that I think that, it was never meant that you would see the insides of these pipes. So this was one where the volume would actually be the spaces defined by the lines.
Sure.
You know, that the courtyard we actually really used the courtyard, as most of the proposals do, I think, as an accomplice. Right, that it's the negotiation between this kind of drawn line and this kind of container that defines the volume. But I think if I understand your question correctly, what you're pointing out is because, and that's why I like this view, you're sort of greeted by this volume of a line that is so large that you could potentially enter. But we sort of intentionally end capped everything so that it would always flicker between these lines that are so volumetric, you could enter them, but in fact are defining the volume around them.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting, especially in the context where you guys have been incredibly rigorous about interrogating your work as a kind of ongoing evolutionary project. And there's self-similarity from one project to the next, which has been an explicit priority for you. And certain elements or strategies, either bodies or strategies, migrate forward and back. And so it's very fluid and dynamic and open-ended. This project, and they're all brilliant for different reasons. I suppose I went to this started with it because it seems to me, and this is one of the first projects you've ever worked on together. Am I?
This was our third, I think.
Third, okay. I mean, to me, that's why I called it, I described it as also as almost an aspirational diagram. Because although it was a brilliant response to the particular project and program at hand, having a kind of minimalist sensibility, starting with the line and the line able to dilate and expand and contract in terms of its length and cross section. It actually can accommodate, and this is highly conceptual, all of your projects. And in my mind, it also has the qualities of a kind of a new urbanism, right? So I knew that you couldn't acquire access to the middle of the line for this project. But if you think about it, as you move over to the project in Detroit, right, and you're beginning to expand, and those lines and tubes are taking on a far more complex and intelligent morphological shape. You're now inside. They're vessels, right? And something that you use the word uncanny and kind of strangeness. There's a sensuality in the work, and even to some extent an eroticism when you get close, right? Because there are orifices. There's an enormous amount of interest in the topology, kind of taking on a kind of an immersive vessel around your body. You're interested in texture and color. I mean, there's another reading, I think, that in terms of the aesthetics and the sensibility of the work, which would not be inconsistent with the things that you're talking about, right?
Right.
I'm sure you can find another core term for that. But I'm just fascinated by the inheritance, the kind of genomic migration of some of the ideas as they and the bodies that materialize out of those ideas that move from one project forward and back. If we jump forward to the house, just curious, beautifully strange, and that's was intended in the thesis. There's it's now hit a scale where a single occupant or a family has to confront and negotiate some of that strangeness, some of those accidental formations, some of those kind of signifiers, for the lack of a better term. What was the tell us about the client and the response to the proposal?
Oh, you want to go, Kelly?
No, go ahead. Do you want to talk about House of Course or?
Well, yeah, I'll start with House of Course.
Client. Okay.
Actually, go to 106. Go to 106. Yeah. So I think House of Course was a speculative project, Evan. It was, it was a real site.
Right.
It's very typical of a Los Angeles neighborhood. But we were interested in maybe taking that jump to, what happens when a core is so large that it is occupiable. And, the previous project was sort of this mid-rise office tower that we were interested in. And we thought, well, let's really dive into this idea. And this is where the term core really came to bear in the research. I think it shows up previously, but we really weren't working on what does it mean to have, what's the core of a house? What's the core of architecture? And so we actually hadn't ever done a project at the scale of a house in our practice. So we just did this speculative project and sort of said, well, what if we kind of blew the Foursquare up, which is pretty typical of the kind of bungalow in LA, and started to kind of have to hold all of these cores together with a ring. Obviously, that then becomes in dialogue with a very current topic here in Los Angeles about the rise of densification of lots and ADU, accessory dwelling units, in addition to the newest zoning rule where single family housing lots can get zoned as multifamily with more prevalence than ever before. And so we started to think, well, what happens? And that's where the kind of game board came in, what happened if these cores, and this is where it was a little bit hokey, or a little bit, weird in our way. What happens if these cores just landed in people's backyards and how they negotiated existing buildings? So that project was sort of speculative, but we were, let's say, Evan, being projective. We were hoping that this would get us into the next scale of work. And so this project is a client-based project where we are working with a kind of a horror writer in Studio City. And so he and his wife own this little L-shaped house here. And post-pandemic, they both now work at home, but they're sharing the house to do that. And so they're looking to sort of make a writer's office for him and a theater on the ground floor. And so we kind of did this on the heels of House of Cores research and sort of said, well, how could we start to think of, we call this the writer's block, a little bit, another kind of pun here, but you can maybe see here, I don't know if this comes full circle, but here you can see where lines are used actually as objects like bars and things like that. But you also can see how the line also becomes threshold, right? It becomes something so large that you can enter it, you can occupy, you can sit in it. But it's a little bit more, this one's a little tamer because it does have to sort of fit in the block of the neighborhood.
No, I think they're fantastic. And the other project that you said was a speculative project. I imagine the realism of zoning and codes and the cost of materials and setback and all this actually is productive data information. It simply is another player in the rule set, and it tells you what you can't do.
Right.
So it actually limits the infinite nature of the work in a very positive and productive way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, the goal for this one, we're working on another one as well right now that we're in very early schematic, and it's much smaller, but I think, how do we preserve the kind of aesthetic and the language that we find in House of Cores, but also, figure out a way to have 80% of this pretty typical framing, right? And very standard materials. And so, that finding that line, I think, between meeting those two objectives is the challenge for this client-based work.
Well, I wish you guys all the best with these projects because they're spectacular and I can't wait to see them built. I'm kind of going back for a second. How was the Detroit research received in Venice? Because both the design and the drawings and the models were really quite, tour de force, right? I'm sure it brought an enormous amount of exposure for the firm.
Yeah, I mean, I think trying to find the like a good place to land with this, but for this answer, but I grew up in Detroit, a few miles from this particular site, just coincidentally. And so,
Oh, wow.
So I had an understanding, of it as a as a kid growing up, but I hadn't lived there for a long time. And so one of the things that we did was spend some time there, and there were, many voices. It wasn't just architects and developers, but it was people associated with the river redevelopment, the river walk redevelopment, and transit, authorities and things like this that were talking about really like everyday needs of this particular site. And so one thing I think we knew right away, and part of it was just that, this kind of understanding, this experience of Detroit was the way it was when I lived there and grew up, and still to this day, we can find those kinds of moments. And so there's such unique ways of understanding the built environment, especially in an urban center, that we wanted to preserve some of that. And so we also knew that we were going into that room, into that particular pavilion with other architects that would most likely be doing a singular building in a kind of large, or a single building in a large site. And so we wanted to kind of work against that and actually offer like programs as mundane as an extension to the post office, or customs kind of annex, given the relationship to or the adjacency to Canada, for example.
I do want to, in addition to the novelty of the form making here, because I think those buildings would be extraordinary to occupy, I do want to call attention to the distributed model. You certainly used another term, but the fact that you've activated the public space in between the buildings, and it seems, based on what I understood, Maurice Cox's agenda for Detroit was precisely that. That the juxtaposition between the middle and the periphery, between the monumentality of the kind of modernist buildings and then that residential domestic field work needed to be reassessed in such a way that it was far more friendly and embracing of the community. And I just think that there's a stage set here out in the public domain, which would be quite extraordinary. And there's something very compelling and relevant and progressive about this as a strategy. So I commend you on that.
Oh,
I would imagine you guys, from the work that you have shown us, you're as interested in working at the scale of the city as you are at the scale of a house or installation.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sort of obsessed with the mid-rise. So I would love it if our first project could be like, a 15-story mid-rise chunky mass. But alas, it's probably going to be a few interiors, maybe a house or two, and then we'll make it to the mid-size mass. But
well, you need one more developer to make it a tripart collaboration here.
Yeah, for sure.
How is your collaboration different than the one that you've got with, I don't have their names in front of me right now, the two other collaborators that you're working with? What is it? Adam and Kyle.
Adam and Kyle.
Yeah.
Our role in Possible Mediums was much more as as professors, as like researchers, and was very pedagogic. The four of us were teaching at 4 universities in the Midwest, and started that project as a way to explore and expand the kind of ways of representing and developing architecture. And so our relationship was much more one of kind of a curatorial relationship together, where we were sort of organizing initially conferences, then an exhibition, then a set of workshops. And it was related to each of the 4 of our research and our individual work, but it was also very aggressively helping us to the pedagogic work that we were all doing at our 4 individual universities.
Right.
And then ultimately, our relationship developed into the ability to kind of put that book together, which included many people, I think like up to like 44 people, as a way to kind of exhibit how these expanded forms of representing and thinking through the artifacts of architecture could be expanded. So our relationship with them was less about like designing projects and more about designing pedagogy, events, and research.
And how, just out of curiosity, not to put you on the spot here, but how do you see the education of an architect changing, evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And this may be based on a variety of reasons, forces, situations, from the pandemic to partisan politics, to social justice. I don't know, or to the autonomous kind of creative project where one has to look inwards in order to figure out how to move out into the world.
Oh, that's a tough question.
Yeah, I know. But you guys are so brilliant. I have full confidence you've got some ideas on that anyway.
5 to 10 years.
I mean, I would say that I think that the role of professors and those that are interested in developing pedagogic content, like I think we all are, I think that I believe, maybe selfishly, that that's still going to be incredibly important. But I think that I think it's going to be more that we are developing sort of structures of pedagogy, and that the increasing input of students and their dialogue with each other, I think, is going to need to have more space as pedagogy evolves. I just think the content of what is important is changing so much faster than it ever did before. And so I do believe in expertise. I believe in experience. I think that within the academic environment, I hope that, there's still value to those things. But I've never been more humbled as a professor than I have been in the last 2 years to really just acknowledge, all the things I don't know and all of the things that are important to kind of to consider. And that I think students today are much more open and aware of bringing those things into their education, as opposed to overlaying them on top of their education. Right. And I think that negotiation is going to be something that it'll be a negotiation. I think pedagogic work is going to be much more of a negotiation than it had been 10 to 20 years ago.
I like that vision. Kelly, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we were talking about it a bit before we started the lecture with Robert, which is the kind of loss of maybe the in-person lecture, that the loss is actually in the student-to-student communication, even like the kind of whisper, to the person next to you when you see something you like or you see something you don't like. And that maybe, even as someone that's just recently returned to in-person teaching and thinking that I have maybe the best strategy for how to now communicate outside of the classroom, given that's the only way we communicated before. And the students are actually coming with like a whole host of other ways of not just communicating, not just, text messaging and things like that, but actually sharing their work with one another. And I feel like I think I know, and I, suggest we do one thing, and they're like, well, there's actually a much better way to do that. And so I feel like I'm kind of learning from the students that they've actually been communicating in this way for quite a long time. And we're now just kind of enveloping it into, let's say, the formats with which we teach. So kind of opening up to that, I would say, has been kind of a major shift in the last couple of years. To the kids, they're all right.
Yeah, I was going to say that, certainly things have become exponentially more complicated, increasing the urgency that that our profession and discipline respond.
Mhm.
And it's, it seems to me that, prior to COVID, and I'm making a very broad generalization now, that there many architecture schools seem to reside within a kind of siloed model, and that some were explicitly more interested in the poetics of architecture, and the deep disciplinary search for something new, something novel, and of course meaningful, and others maybe in terms of a kind of ecological design or maybe community-based design. I think the world has so dramatically changed that represents an antiquated paradigm, and I'm afraid, and that's why I brought this up. I'm afraid that given the amount of momentum, deservingly so, around these social environmental issues, that a more speculative kind of trajectory search in architecture might be deemed somewhat, it will be threatened. How do I put this? I find your work to be incredibly unique and distinct, and it's impregnated with an infinite set of possibilities in terms of interpretive futures. And although we didn't talk about all of those other issues, and maybe I implied it with this last drawing in terms of the contribution it would make to the city of Detroit. I actually think you guys are pretty sophisticated and capable of taking on a whole range and demand of architectural issues. And you have focused right now on a set of disciplinary ones that are most important to you. And you've done it in the most kind of remarkable and rigorous way. But I want to protect institutions like SoA-RPI, right, and a number of more kind of speculative programs, precisely because I actually think that the creative imagination inside those places, like RPI, should be and are capable of assuming leadership roles in terms of overcoming these larger existential challenges, right? So, I mean, you guys have just started your practice. It's amazing what you've been able to achieve in a short period of time. And I see the work very seriously. And I, not unlike an anamorphic projection where you move the point of reference and it changes the entire value system of an image. All you have to do is shift that vantage point in terms of intentionality, and this work takes on another kind of wake of influence and impact. And I bring that up because I don't want the students to misinterpret this work, as a kind of a private, personal investigation into a series of wonderfully kind of speculative ideas. But I see this as much concrete and real and pragmatic and opportunistic as any architecture that we present in a lecture series. And I can guarantee the audience 5, 10, 20 years from now, you guys are your practice is going to flourish, and you're going to be telling me that you're trying to keep it down to 100 people, and you've got commissions in Latin America and Europe, and you don't have enough time in the day to teach and build. I mean that. It's not just a fantastic statement. I really do believe you guys have a great future ahead of you. So I suppose those are my final words, but
Those are some good words. Thank you, Evan.
yeah, no, I love the work, and it's really, really inspiring. And I know we didn't get any questions from the students that attended this today, but don't misinterpret that as anything. But oh my God, it's great. I can't wait to get back to my studio and work on my own project. I'm sure you've inspired everyone this evening.
Oh, I hope so. And if it helps students, I'm heading back to studio right after this lecture. I got 2 more hours.
So I don't know if there's any final words, Kristy, Kelly, that you want to share with the students before you leave.
I would just say maybe more to share with you, Evan, that, in addition to the really eloquent introduction, that this has kind of also felt like a critique of the work in the most productive of ways. And so we don't always get that kind of engagement when we give these lectures, especially with someone like you. So we really appreciate the time and the energy that you put into not just looking at the work and listening to it, but really reading it. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess to the students, thank you for attending tonight. I know it's a lot after a long studio day. So we hope that it kind of brings you energy, and we hope that it asks you to sort of wrestle with some questions in your own weird ways. And we hope that you have a wonderful completion to the semester.
Great. Kristy, Kelly, thank you, and wish you all the best with teaching and practice. And we
Awesome.
can't wait until COVID is over and we can invite you to our campus so we can see it in person on a giant stage.
Oh, that would be great. We'll give you a whole different lecture.
All right. All the best. Thank you.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye.